welcome to my channel. I hope you're having a great day. I'm making this video as I promised you guys in my previous video about my 1995 Mustang GTS to go over a detailed list of all the modifications that I bought this car with. I will also give you guys a list of all the issues that I've ran into, and some of them I fixed, some of them I still need to address. If you haven't watched my previous video, I'll leave a link in the description. I will also leave a thumbnail at the end of this video so you guys can go check it out. I shared some footage of the car with you guys and gave you a brief introduction to this vehicle. So if you haven't watched it, please go check that out so you're up to speed.
Do it. Do it now.
Alright, now let's go over the list of all the aftermarket parts that this car came with when I purchased it. The car has cold air intake, which is a BBK cold air intake. It comes with Edelbrock Performer upper and lower intake manifold. It has Crane comp cam. It has a Pro-M mass air meter, Ford Motorsport 24-pound injectors, BBK long tube headers, BBK high flow X-pipe, Flowmaster 17212 catback exhaust. It has a short throw shifter on it, H&R Super Sport springs, Takiko Blue HB shocks, dual piston calipers from a 2013 Cadillac ATS-V, which can be installed on these vehicles with minor modifications. The front rotors are also upgraded to the 13-inch Cobra rotors, which are slotted and cross-drilled as well. The car has 410 gears in the rear end, and it has Maximum Motorsport full-length subframe connectors. It also has the GT40 heads on the engine. That's about it for all the mods that I've bought this car with. Now I might be forgetting some, but I will try to add it to the description as I remember them. Now it's time for the fun part. I'm going to talk to you guys about all the issues that I've had with this car, some of them which I fixed and some of them still need to be addressed. The first issue that I encountered with this car was after a week or so of driving it, I was driving down the street and I went to shift from third gear into fourth, and there was a kind of like a banging noise, and the shifter completely gave out and the car was stuck in third gear. So I pulled over and played around with the shifter a bit, and I was able to get the car in second gear, and I had to drive all the way back home in second gear. Once I got home, I opened up the shifter and I realized that the shifter had completely given out, and the short throw shifter was broken. So I had to source a new short throw shifter for it, which I lucked out and I was able to find one locally for about $150, I think. And once I put that in, it fixed the issue and I was able to shift normally, and the car was drivable again. Now the second issue that I ran into was about a week or two after the purchase of the car. I realized that my gauges in the cluster were not reading accurately. Also, my RPM gauge started working on and off and showing the wrong RPM and sometimes getting stuck. So I looked into that, and it ended up being that the actual cluster was broken and it needs a rebuild. And I haven't addressed that yet because it doesn't really affect the drivability. Another issue that I encountered with this car, which took me down a rabbit hole, was the car was showing that it was overheating. Now at first I thought that it was because my gauges weren't reading properly, and that was just the issue that was associated with that. But after a while, I kind of got paranoid and started digging a little bit deeper. And I realized that the wiring for my temperature sensor was not done properly, and there was a bunch of shorts in it, which explained why like the temperature gauge was like cold, and then it would jump to hot, and then it would like jump back down, and it was just doing all sorts of funky stuff. And I realized that the wiring was not done properly on the temperature gauge. So I fixed that and I put a new temperature sensor in the car, and I thought that that would fix this issue, but I was wrong. So I drove the car for another week or so, and I realized that it's still overheating here and there. Also, my oil pressure gauge started showing very high pressures, and it would drop all of a sudden and then like do the same thing basically my temperature gauge was doing. I started looking into that, and I realized that my oil pressure gauge was wired the same way to my oil pressure sensor, and there was a bunch of shorts, and just it looked like someone just used like very cheap wires and connectors to just basically connect them, and it was giving me the wrong reading. So I got the oil pressure sensor rewired, and I put a new one in there as well. Now when I was driving the car, I still realized that it's still overheating, and it felt like the temperature sensor and the wiring didn't fix it. So I had to take a deeper dive into why this issue was still coming up. And once I looked into it a bit more, I realized that there's a leak where my thermostat housing meets the lower intake manifold, and so I figured that that's probably the problem, and if I fix it, it would go away. I was wrong on that one as well. I fixed the thermostat housing. I put a new gasket and bought a new thermostat while I was at it. And after a couple of days, I noticed that it's still leaking. So I looked into it a little bit more, and I realized that the previous owner had used a thermostat housing from the previous generation of these cars, which is the Mustang Fox body that has the same engine, but it has like certain parts are different on it, and he had used the thermostat housing from that engine on my engine, which wasn't compatible with my thermostat and was causing a leak. So I bought a new thermostat housing and I replaced that. Once I did that, I thought that okay, this is probably the issue that I've been having, and that's why the car's been overheating. So I drove it for a few days, and I noticed that the temperature gauge was still reading kind of higher, and it was overheating from time to time. I looked into it a bit more, and I took it to a shop that was fairly knowledgeable and knew how to like work on these cars, because most of the shops I took this car to, they turned me down because this car was modified, and most shops don't really want to do anything and any work on a modified vehicle.
What is your gender? My gender. I'm a mechanic.
Once I took it to this guy, he took a look at the car, and we kind of looked around the cooling system and tried to figure out what the issue was. And he told me that my radiator cap wasn't sealing properly, and this car comes with an aftermarket radiator as well. And he figured that it just wasn't the right cap that was installed on this radiator, which was causing the system not to pressurize and the engine to overheat. So we got another radiator cap for a SN95 model and installed it on my radiator, and I was like, okay, this is gonna for sure fix my problem, and there will be no more overheating. But was I ever wrong on that? So after 2 or 3 days of driving this car, I realized that it's still doing the same thing and it's still overheating here and there, and the gauges were reading higher a bit. So I took it back to this guy and he started looking into it a bit more, and we realized that the stock radiator cap is not compatible with this radiator. And since we had no information on what type of aftermarket radiator was installed on this car, I had to kind of buy a few different radiator caps, and actually none of them worked, and we ended up having to buy one with a safety lever, which fixed our problem and it stopped leaking from the radiator cap. And at that point I was like, okay, this is probably the final problem with the cooling system and this will solve the issue. So I drove it for a few more days and I realized that it's still overheating. Once I went back to the shop, we kind of talked about it, and he said that he suspects that my cooling fan is not kicking on because these cars have a 2-speed cooling fan, and it's a very common issue where sometimes the high speed doesn't work or sometimes they just don't work altogether. And there's a module that controls the cooling fan, which is called the CCRM, and we figured that that's the culprit. So he kind of checked it for signal, and the module wasn't putting out any signals for the high speed fan to kick on when the temperature was going past a certain degree.
Why did you do this to me?
We looked into buying a new module, but I guess they've stopped making these, and after a bit of digging I was able to find a rebuilt one, and we put it in the car and figured that that's gonna fix the problem for sure, and everything would be fine, and the fan's gonna kick on and everything, and he told me to drive it home and see how it goes. So I drove the car home and drove it for another couple of days, and the car was still overheating, and the fan was kicking on, but it wasn't. I figured it still wasn't going into high speed. I went back and we kind of dug into the wiring again, and he checked the CCRM to see if it's getting any signal from the ECU, which is the engine control unit, and there was no signal coming from my ECU to kick the fan into high gear, and we figured that it's probably my ECU. We took the ECU out and it looked really beat up and it looked really old. A bunch of connections looked like it had oxidization on it, so we figured that the ECU is the problem. Now I replaced the ECU. Luckily I was able to find a local one, and just like a second-hand local one which was working, and we replaced the ECU and was able to this time get the fan to kick into high gear, and it was working because we made sure that it was going into high gear after a certain temperature, and at the time it seemed like it was keeping the engine cool when it was just idling and sitting. I drove the car back and drove it for another day or two and realized that it's still overheating, and I looked around, looked under the car, and realized that there's a coolant leak coming from the radiator now because the system was pressurizing finally, and the radiator I guess had a small crack in it, and once the system started pressurizing it started pushing the coolant out of the radiator. Now there's another issue with the cooling system, and I just felt defeated at that point, and I just stopped driving the car for a bit, and I still haven't really addressed the radiator problem and I'm looking into my options as to what I can replace it with. Once the car was parked for a little while, I decided to drive it again and maybe give it another chance, and order up a bunch of parts for it and fix it and get it going again. Once I did that, I realized that my clutch is slipping and it's giving out, and I noticed that there's a major oil leak now coming from where my transmission meets the engine.
No!
Also from where the oil filter is. I went back to this guy and we took a look at the clutch, and we figured that the clutch is done, and we went to look at the oil filter and realized that this car was previously supercharged, and the person who took all the supercharger parts off didn't do it properly and left all the oil lines for the supercharger and the engine. So they were still there and like leading to nowhere, and they were just capped. And this was preventing the shop from being able to put a proper size oil filter on the car, and we didn't know what type of oil filter was used to like make it work. And so we had to take all of these oil lines off, and that was just a headache of its own, and it costed me a bunch of money.
The last time I saw something like you, I flushed it.
But eventually we were able to fix the oil filter leak, and he moved on to fixing the clutch and trying to see where the oil leak was coming from, where my transmission was meeting the engine, and we figured that my rear main seal is done too. So I bought a new one, and he said that he'll replace it once he replaces the clutch. Once he opened up the clutch and took the transmission off the car, he realized that the flywheel wasn't installed properly on this car, and it wasn't the rear main seal that was leaking, and it was actually the bolts that were holding the flywheel onto the engine basically that were leaking through. So I ended up having to buy some new bolts for that as well, and we were able to fix that issue and put a new clutch in. And the car was working fine. It was going in gears now, and everything was good. So I was pretty happy that this issue was resolved, and I figured that I'll slowly start fixing all the other stuff and deal with the overheating and all of that. I drove the car for a bit, and once the temperatures outside started getting a little hotter, I noticed that I was kind of having a hard time putting the car into gear again, and I had to really push the clutch in order to be able to go in gear and shift gears basically after the car warmed up. So we looked into that and realized that there was a cheap clutch cable used on this car, and that's what was causing this problem, because for whatever reason it wasn't engaging the clutch properly, and just giving me all sorts of problems for shifting and stuff. So that's another issue that I have to address in the future. Another thing that came up in the process of dealing with the clutch and the transmission basically was that once we took the drive shaft off, realized that the drive shaft was really beat up, and it had a bunch of loose U-joints and such. And I've never really gone that fast with the car, but the shop told me that if I go past a certain speed, there's a high chance that I'll have a crazy vibration in my transmission and basically the driveline, and that would be caused by the drive shaft not being rebuilt, and basically it wasn't even balanced. So he said that that's another thing that I'll have to address in the future. When I was taking the car back, I decided to test and see if it'll actually do that. And I went a little faster. I took the car on the highway and I just went a little bit faster speeds, and lo and behold, it actually started shaking the whole transmission, and basically like the whole car was just, it felt like the tires were imbalanced or something like that. So I realized that he wasn't wrong, and I'll need to address the drive shaft issue as well. For the most part, these are the issues that I've had with this car, and it's just basically made owning this car a not really fun experience, and has prevented me from driving it that much over the past 3 or 4 years that I've owned this car. Now I have a few options as to what to do at this point, because I still have to spend quite a bit of money on this car to get it back up to par, and it's probably not even guaranteed that there wouldn't be another issue popping up, because I've lost all faith in the previous owner and what he told me, because he told me that the car was fully gone through and everything was dealt with, and it's basically good to go. But
why you always lying?
That was not true. The more and more I dug deep into this car, and the issues that I found with it just kind of told me that this guy just put this car together and wanted to make a quick buck. Now I'm looking into my options. I'm trying to see what I should do, and whether I should rebuild the existing engine. And you know, I kind of want a little bit more horsepower out of this car, so I can do a supercharger or maybe turbo or something like that. Or I can do an engine swap, which is what I'm kind of leaning towards at this point, because with the new Coyote engines, you can just swap one of those in this car and have a good close to 400 horsepower reliably, and you know, it'll be basically a stock engine and super reliable, and it's not that hard to do in these cars. What I need you guys to do is in the comments tell me what you think I should do with this car in the future. Should I rebuild the engine and stay true to the pushrod 5-liter and keep this car with its original engine? Or should I go the Coyote swap route and get a Coyote motor and put it in this car, which I personally think is going to cost me less in the long run if I was to rebuild this engine and get everything up to par and put a supercharger or a turbo kit on it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I look forward to sharing more of my experiences with this car with you guys and bringing you along on my journey to get this car up to par and make it a fun and enjoyable car to drive again. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please comment, like, and subscribe. And I will try to make more videos about this car and keep you guys updated on what I'm doing and where I'm taking this car.